Today we'll be talking about the art styles coming out of Europe from roughly 1918 to 1939, in between the two major world wars. This was a time of massive political change in Europe. Authoritarian and communist governments changed the way that people made art, while others rallied against the changes with art of protest. Overall, it was a time of great divergence in style for modernism. Here's a list of important terms, people, and places to look out for in this lecture. After the conclusion of World War I in 1918, all of Europe reeled from the massive loss. On top of destroyed infrastructure and massive debt, there was an unspeakably large loss of human life. Nearly an entire generation had been wiped out. Most artists responded to this cultural shift in two different ways, either by working to rebuild Europe in their art, turning more towards the practical and functional, or by harshly criticizing the governments and regimes that had led to the senseless violence in the first place. Following the end of World War I, the socialist Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian Tsar in 1917, which resulted in a civil war that lasted until 1920 and saw the creation of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Initially, the Bolsheviks supported the forward-thinking avant-garde artists, and vice versa. This is evidenced in Vladimir Tatlin's model for the monument to the Third International, which never had the resources to get built. However, the plans for the building were lofty. It would house conferences and congress meetings, executive committees, and propaganda offices, with a radio atop the whole building. It was designed to help further the worldwide spread of communism. At the same time as its utilitarian function, it had an undeniably avant-garde design. The twisted metal form is incredibly modernist, evoking images of the Eiffel Tower. As time went on, however, a group of artists called constructivists emerged who believed that form should follow function in the strictest sense, and that the embellishments of the avant-garde were amoral. Constructivists believed that self-expression in art was weak, unproductive, and socially irresponsible. Artists that supported the political system in place should create useful objects that benefited the collective, like new inventions and innovations. Painting was seen as particularly useless. For the constructivists, another acceptable use of art was propaganda for the Soviet Union. This poster, entitled "Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge," was meant to do just that. The red wedge, a simple abstract form, represents the Bolsheviks. The white circle that it penetrates and breaks apart represents the white movement, those that fought against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. In a way, we can still see the influence of modernism. The style of constructivists came straight out of the Cubo-Futurist movement in Russia that we looked at a few lectures ago. However, it has been stripped down and made very minimal. Its meaning is clearly and succinctly portrayed, with no room for interpretation. Its jagged shapes and stark colors get the message across easily, and most importantly, it has a definite function beyond being art for enjoyment. By the mid-1920s, abstraction had been abandoned for the more accessible and understandable socialist realism. It was deemed more politically useful than abstract art and became the official art style of the Soviet Union. Most utilitarian artists that supported the political regime made the switch easily, but those who refused lost jobs or status as artists. Like realism has always done, starting with Courbet and Millet in France at the dawn of the modernist avant-garde movement, the realism of the USSR aimed to shed light on the working class. In this case, to glorify workers, peasants, revolutionary activists, and the Red Army. We also see a rise around this time in the amount of agitprop, or agitation propaganda. Communist propaganda spread in the form of posters, pamphlets, and other less formal means. The simplistic lines and blocks of color are reminiscent of Art Nouveau, but the quick and stylized figures are like cartoons, even more accessible and easy to understand. These posters usually contained highly politicized messages aiming to recruit people to join the party and support its ideals. Elsewhere in Europe, art was moving in different directions. In the Netherlands, de stijl movement emerged, literally meaning the style, and it became the focal point for Dutch artists, architects, and designers. The movement valued minimalism and simplicity above all else. They believed that there were two types of beauty, sensual or subjective beauty, and a higher, rational, more universal beauty based on simplicity of line, color, and form. One of the leading artists of this movement, Piet Mondrian, is well known for his simple geometric paintings of primary colors and bold, dark lines. We also see an emphasis on harmony and balance between opposing things, such as black and white, primary colors and neutral colors, and horizontals and verticals. Mondrian and other de style painters wanted to create a visual equilibrium that would take over all of visual culture, not just painting. They believed it represented perfection and aimed to spread the style. The style translated well to architecture, with its blocky geometric forms and simple colors. Even with such a different medium, it is easy to see how this house was inspired by the early paintings of de style artists. Both outside and inside the house, there is an asymmetry of shapes and forms, recalling Mondrian, and the constant opposing visuals of primary colors and neutral tones. At the same time, everything is very contained, very simple and minimalist. In Germany, a similar trend emerged with the foundation of the Bauhaus school. The founders of this school considered de style in the Netherlands and purism, a similar style in France, to be too rigid and believed that design should come from a more organic place. Bauhaus focused primarily on design and architecture rather than the fine arts. They wanted to combine the modern, stripped-down aesthetic of de style with more functionality. The Bauhaus school was short-lived. It was closed in 1933 by Hitler, who opposed modernist art. However, its simplistic geometric forms helped to establish the international style of architecture, what was at the time considered the standard for modern architecture, and still inspires architecture today. In the early years of the Nazi Party, and later on as well, Hitler caused incalculable destruction to the art world with his suppression of the avant-garde in Germany. Once a mediocre landscape artist in his youth, he was never able to master his skills or sell his work. Hitler developed an intense hatred for the avant-garde. First, he forced the closure of the Bauhaus school, which he considered politically subversive. He then had all expressionist and avant-garde work removed from museums, and the artists threatened publicly and barred from buying more materials for their art. He mounted an exhibition of this stolen art called degenerate art, and despite his intention to mock it, millions showed up to view the work. Much of this art was stolen by soldiers and sold outside of Germany. Some of it has shown up recently after being held by families for generations, but much of it was destroyed or remains unaccounted for. At the same time in France, and slightly later in Spain, thanks to Salvador Dalí, a style called Surrealism was emerging. It was an offshoot of Dada, and just like that movement, it was a reaction against logic and reason. The Surrealists embraced the irrational, disorderly, and aberrant. What truly set them apart from the Dadaists was their focus on psychology and the unconscious mind. Building on the scholarship of Freud, Surrealists wanted to capture the untamed, untempered base instincts of the unconscious mind, which they believed were contained by the rationality and reason of the conscious mind. They wanted their art to represent the darkest, wildest corners of the human mind. They attempted to release their own unconscious minds and thoughts through methods of dream analysis, free association, stream of consciousness writing, and hypnotic trances. Dalí in particular focused on aspects of the unconscious mind relating to sexuality and violence. We see these themes in his dreamlike art, along with ideas of putrefaction or decomposition, perhaps due to Dalí's exposure to the death and violence of war, both with World War I and the Spanish Civil War. In this chaotic scene, full of distorted, human-like figures and a shapeless, semi-organic blob, all shadowed beneath a dark black cloud, we are witnessing what Dalí claimed were irrational, anxiety-filled images of his nightmares. The work of Dalí, like many other surrealists, often defies interpretation. There are many different meanings to be gleaned from these works, none of them necessarily wrong or right. In one of his most famous paintings, The Persistence of Memory, we can see one of his themes repeated. An obsession with time passing, the decay of things, the ephemeral nature of life. Reality has been distorted, however, in a dreamlike way. Clocks melt in the foreground like butter, Ants and flies swarming them suggest decomposition and rot. The barren landscape is lifeless and alien. Dali's paintings have a tendency to evoke anxiety and unease from the empathetic viewer, searching for conscious meaning within them. French surrealist painter René Magritte was more concrete and naturalistic in his works, but they are just as ambiguous to interpret in their dreamlike quality. In The Lovers, for example, two figures embracing and kissing have their heads covered by death shroud-looking fabric, implying both suffocation and a lack of intimacy or affection despite their closeness. The extreme close-up of the image makes it hard to look away and gives the viewer a sense of unease. In Time Transfixed, it feels as though we are in a dream, a collage of different things one might see over the course of the day that are taken in by the unconscious mind and then mashed together in a nonsensical image. The crisp clarity of Magritte's images increase their dreamlike quality. He manages to capture the feeling of a dream, wherein things are not as they should be, but your brain accepts it as reality nonetheless. In one of his most famous paintings, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, or This is not a pipe, Magritte cheekily alludes to one of the main criticisms surrealists, expressionists, and most modernists had of the overly idealized and smooth-surfaced Academy painting of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Artists of the avant-garde wanted to draw attention to the artificiality of painting, no longer striving to record nature faithfully. Why strive for naturalism when photography could do that? Instead, artists were moving farther and farther away from naturalism and wanted paintings to reflect the inner workings of the human mind, rather than just what one saw. In this painting, he has created a naturalistic depiction of a pipe, but reminds the viewer that it is not, in fact, a pipe. It's a painting, simply a depiction, not a reflection of reality. Surrealists in France and Spain also inspired other artists around the world who were drawn to the otherworldly style. Frida Kahlo, a Mexican artist, was a pioneer of surrealist art in Mexico. Confined to her bed for most of her adult life due to a severe injury from her youth, Kahlo painted dreamlike creations of her fears, pain, and nightmares from her bed. Her life was filled with tragedy, and the raw emotional qualities that she brought to surrealism make her stand out in a category of her own. We will talk more about Kahlo when we move on to the Americas. When World War II began, themes of violence and war became even more prevalent in surrealist art and other avant-garde art as well. Suffering was widespread, and for Spaniards, who had just experienced a bloody civil war that may have killed millions, the number has been disputed by historians for decades. Many Spanish artists, such as Dalí and Picasso, tried to capture the horror and pain that was tearing their country apart and causing such suffering. In Picasso's Guernica, he has depicted a horrific event in which German bombers, who supported the nationalist fascist movement in Spain, bombed a town called Guernica in the Basque region of Spain, destroying 75% of the standing architecture and killing thousands. The senseless act of violence was done merely as a training exercise for the German soldiers. Picasso, horrified by the thoughtless slaughter and the pain of his countrymen, painted this massive, historical-style painting of the event. Guernica is a scene of brutality, chaos, and suffering. Abstracted animals and humans with gaping mouths scream in anguish amongst jagged shapes resembling crumbling architecture, trampling each other. The stark black, white, and gray add to the dramatic horror of the scene. A figure of a bull, perhaps a symbol of Spain itself, stands over a woman, her head thrown back in agony as she weeps over the dead child in her arms. Guernica demonstrates how the artists of the avant-garde embraced expression over naturalism to depict the rawest, deepest emotions of human experience. It is a historic reminder of the brutal human cost of unrestrained warfare. Here are some major takeaways from today's lecture. The art created in Europe from 1918 to 1939, in between the two world wars, was greatly affected by that global conflict. Artists very much were focused either on creating art that rebuilt their countries and territories after the destruction of World War I, like the constructivists in Russia and the De Stijl in the Netherlands, or, in contrast, were very much focused on criticizing the regimes of their countries that had caused the violence in the first place. In the case of Surrealism, very much criticizing the overall sense of morality and rationality that their countries used to justify war. Because of the range of political regimes in power at this time and their varying levels of authoritarianism, we see a huge variety of different styles occurring at this time, which really represent a major divergence in style. This divergence will greatly affect the art that comes out of Europe in the future and the art in America that is stylistically influenced by Europe.